This class is about the shidduch of the Rebbe Mahara marrying his niece. There seemed to be a little bit of confusion, so I'm recording this brief introduction to just clarify the exact scenario. The Tzemach Tzedek is the third Rebbe of Chabad. He had a number of children. The case in point is his youngest son, whose name was Shmuel, who became known as the Rebbe Mahara, and he was going to marry his niece. There were two nieces who were possible candidates. There was the daughter of his oldest brother, Rebbe Shalom, and his daughter was one candidate for the shidduch, and Rebbe Shalom himself seemed to have wanted the shidduch, to have the opportunity to have his younger brother as his son-in-law and to have his father as his mechutan, etc. And then the next brother, whose name was Reb Chaim Shnei Zalman, also a brother of the Rebbe Mahara, and also a son of the Tzemach Tzedek, and also the father of a girl who was a possible candidate for marrying the Rebbe Mahara, who also was very interested in the shidduch, and in the end, in fact, prevailed. It was his daughter who married the Rebbe Mahara. So that's the scenario, and that should hopefully make listening to the class understandable and clear. So I bumped into this fascinating topic in connection with the Siyum of Masechtas Mishpatim. Last week in the Rambam study, we finished the book of Mishpatim with studying the laws of inheritance, and something popped up in the laws of inheritance which sort of brought me around to this topic, as you'll soon see. But that opened up a whole bunch of other interesting discussion points, and there's a lot to cover, but I think it's a fascinating topic, so let's dive straight into it. So we're going to start off by giving you the history of this. The primary source for this story seems to be the diary of Rebbe and Rivka. Rebbe and Rivka is the mother of the Rebbe Rashab and the wife of the Rebbe Marash. So she's the wife of the person in question over here who we're talking about, her husband, but this was his first marriage. In his second marriage, he was married to Rebbe and Rivka, who is, if I'm getting this all the facts right here, the author of these diaries. Eli Rubin has written for Chabad.org sort of a storyline based on these diaries, written in English, and so I'm going to read it for you from the English in Chabad.org. Here goes. This is as part of a history on the Rebbe Maharash's life. In the late 1840s, a tumultuous drama unfolded in Lubavitch. It began with rivalrous excitement and intrigue, and it ended in calamity. By now, all the Tzemach Tzedek's children were married, except for his youngest son, Shmuel, who we call the Rebbe Mahara. His older brothers already had grown daughters, and two of them were vying to make him their son-in-law. The two sons involved were the Tzemach Tzedek's oldest son, Rebbe Shalom, and his second son, Reb Chaim Shnei Zalman. Both of them had daughters of marriageable age, and they wanted their younger brother, the Rebbe Mahara, to marry their daughters. Everyone knew how dearly the Tzemach Tzedek loved the son born to him in his mature period of his life, at a time when his leadership and authority were already well established. Everyone also knew that young Shmuel was unusually talented. Beneath his charismatic and mischievous demeanor, which endeared him to everyone, he hid a serious and sensitive soul. All of Lubavitch was abuzz with speculation and anticipation who would become his bride. Which one of the nieces was going to become the bride of the Rebbe Mahara? In truth, okay, so here he adds in a line. He adds here a line which I'm not 100% convinced of. He says, in truth, the prospective groom did not want to marry either of his nieces. Now, where is he getting that from? There could be two places where he's getting this from. To me, both of them are suggestive, but neither of them are absolute proof. One is that in the tshuva of the Divrei Nechemia, which we're going to get to soon about this shidduch, he references a clause in Shulchan Aruch where the Ramah brings the Maharik that says that if the son wants to marry somebody who the father doesn't want him to marry, so the son doesn't have to listen to the father. And then the question was how and when to apply that halacha. So it's possible that he's deducing from there that in the case in question, the son did not want to marry the the wife that the father wanted him to marry, but that's not conclusive evidence. There's another thing which is quite strange, actually, which we'll have to get to soon. Okay, we can't jump ahead for that. In truth, the prospective groom did not want to marry either of his nieces. This wasn't due to any fault he found in them as individuals, but apparently for a personal reason that remained hidden in his heart. I'm just saying that this is Eli Rubin's speculation. I have not seen any source where he gets those two lines from. But anyway, he was also bothered by all the competitiveness that his older brothers displayed. His father pointed to the commandment of the sages codified by Maimonides. In choosing a bride, one should give preference to the daughter of one's sister or the daughter of one's brother. So the Rambam says you're supposed to marry your niece. We're going to get to that Rambam soon. The prospective groom countered that Maimonides also codified another commandment of the sages, that a man should not privilege one son over another during his lifetime, even with something insignificant, so that one should not come to rivalry and jealousy, as the brothers of Joseph did with Joseph. So this is based on the Gemara. Now the Gemara says in Shabbos, Daf Yud Amud Beis, Amar Rav bar Mechasya, Amar Rav Chama bar Guria, Amar Rav, L'olam alishana adam b'noi bein habanim. A person should not favor one child over the other. Shebishvil mishkal shnei sloim melas, because for a mere 2 sala weight worth of silk, Shenosan Yaakov Yosef Misharbanav, that Yaakov gave to his son Joseph over his other sons, a reference to the Consanguineous pasim, to the special cloak that he made. Niskanu by Echav, his brothers became jealous. One thing led to the next. And our ancestors went down to Egypt. So Yaakov favored Yosef. This was not a good idea. Terrible things came out of that. The whole Golus Mitzrayim. Now, of course, right away the commentaries point out that it would seem that the Golus Mitzrayim was destined already from before, as we find in the Bris Bein HaBesarim, in the covenant to Abraham many years before. It was told that his children would be slaves in a foreign land. However, Tosfos says that maybe the servitude wouldn't have been as bad. The Ritva says that maybe it would have been somewhere else, not Mitzrayim. It just says they would be out of their land. So who knows where it could be? So Yaakov favoring Yosef really sort of knocked the nail in the coffin on that one. By the way, I saw somewhere that Rashi says that it could be the Consanguineous pasim was just a small little amount of silk. It wasn't like a whole coat of silk. It was the same coat as everybody else, but just it had those little silk things on the sleeves, which is interesting because today in the Chassidish Rebbes, a lot of them, the more prominent rabbis will wear sort of like a velvety strip on the collar and on the end of the sleeves. Anyway, so back to the conversation over here. So the Rambam, based on this Gemara, says you shouldn't favor one son over the other. So here the question was, on the one hand, there's a mitzvah to marry your nephew or niece. There's a mitzvah to marry your niece, not your nephew. It's a biblical prohibition for an aunt to marry a nephew, but it is a mitzvah for an uncle to marry a niece. And so on the one hand, we're saying, well, maybe it's a good thing to marry his niece. On the other hand, Dafka, because there was this friction in the family between the two older brothers, or Baruch Shalom and Reb Chaim Shnei Zalman, who both want to have their brother marry their daughter. So maybe this was going to be whichever one that Tzemach Tzedek chooses to become whichever one of his sons he chooses to become his mechutan, right? That he's favoring that son. So maybe you're not supposed to favor one son over the other. So maybe we should avoid the shidduch entirely. So this is the conversation that's going on over here.
But wasn't one son already preferred since he was going to become the Rebbe?
Well, actually, in the case at hand, there was quite some degree of politics, if you will, after the Tzemach Tzedek's passing, as exactly who should be the successor. And in fact, all of his children, bar the oldest, did succeed him on some level. Basically, all of the Tzemach Tzedek's children, besides the oldest, Baruch Shalom, did become Rebbes. The Baruch Shalom himself actually had a physical deformity. He had some handicap or deformity in his arm, and in fact, the famous tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek about certain complications in determining if somebody is right-handed or left-handed was written in regard to the bar mitzvah of his oldest son, because that was affected by his deformity. But other than that, very good point, and that's going to come up in the tshuva of the Din Nechemia, which we're getting to. But either way, here that was part of the discussion over here. This triggered, again, I'm continuing to read from Eli Rubin's article, this triggered a learned debate ranging across the Talmudic corpus, including the early and later commentaries and codifiers of halacha. Eventually, Tzemach Tzedek summarized the various arguments and counter-arguments in a letter addressed to Rabbi Nehemiah Ginsburg of Dubrovna. His dates are 1788 to 1852, one of the foremost pupils of the Alter Rebbe, a renowned adjudicator of Jewish law. Rabbi Nehemiah responded with a lengthy and learned dissertation designed to neutralize the arguments of the son in favor of the arguments set forth by the father. This is not the time or the place to enter into all the complicated details of this response. That's what Eli Rubin is saying. But all who wish to study the issue themselves can find it in Shalos Shuvas Divrei Nehemiah, published in Vilna, 1866. And a new edition of this specific Shuvah has been published in a journal from one of the Kollelem in Crown Heights, and that's the edition I'm going to be using today when we go through the highlights of the Shuvah.
What's the article called?
One of the competing brothers acquired for his daughter a pearled headdress valued at 1,200 silver rubles, and his father-in-law offered a dowry of 5,000 rubles to be paid in gold. Two matching donations of equal value were also pledged, one to the fund of the Chassidim living in the Holy Land, the second to domestic communal charities. The generosity seemed to have swayed that Tzemach Tzedek. He eventually chose his granddaughter Sterna, the daughter of his second son, Reb Chaim Shnei Zalman. By the way, his name at birth was Shnei Zalman, and later the name Chaim was added, as a bride for his youngest son, Rabbi Shmuel, who was only just entering his teens. The wedding was held in the spring of 1848 with much splendorous finery and celebratory excitement. Thousands of Chassidim were in attendance beneath the wedding canopy. Okay, let's continue. But all the joy was premature. Before the week was over, the bride took ill. As her sickness dragged on and intensified, the groom suffered bitterly. He withdrew from his new in-laws' household, returned to his parents' home. Sterna never arose from his sickbed and died about 3 months later. Her cousin, who had been the rival for Rabbi Shmuel's hand, also fell ill and died within a very short time. This double calamity weighed heavily on the Tzemach Tzedek. Okay, etc., etc. You could all look up the article in Chabad.org, which I can send you the reference for exactly later, and see more details. Now, a couple of things. First of all, the way this is referenced on Wikipedia, or Chabadpedia, whatever it's called, they actually write that the reason this Sterna died was because of the Kpeda of Reb Baruch Shalom, because her uncle had a kpeda, how do you say in English a kpeda? He was unhappy that his niece got the shidduch and not his daughter, so because of that kpeda, that caused his niece to die. That was like, an ayin hara or something, and that her, but in turn her death caused the kpeda on her cousin, who was the other bride, and that's why she died. Now this is, somebody just wrote this on the internet. I haven't seen any source for that, but that seems to be some sort of flavor going into the whole parsha over here. Now, another fascinating thing, and I think that I chose to read it from Eli Rubin's summary, even though I think it's a little bit inaccurate in some of the details. The reason I chose to read it is because he does give you the nice sort of the general gist of the flavor of what was going on. In Rebbe's and Rivka's diary, which we referenced before, she describes that the Tzemach Tzedek gave as sort of some sort of appeasement, or not appeasement, of comfort to his youngest son, who's newly widowed son. He gave him some special treatment. He gave him a little office right next to his office. He told him to come in whenever he wants. But the Rebbe Mahara himself said, "Lo do'agti al ha'aveda Rachmanan litzlan." I personally was not so concerned by this loss, because it wasn't mine. So it's unusual expression, and it's not clear exactly what it means, but it's certainly possibly could mean what it seems Eli Rubin is implying that it means, that he was never interested in the shidduch to start with, and so I'm sure he wasn't so happy that his niece passed away, but he wasn't sort of traumatized and in mourning, and he was happy to, so to speak, go on with life. Now, so as Eli Rubin referenced, there is a tshuva from the Divrei Nehemiah to the Tzemach Tzedek about this shidduch, and we're going to get to that, but before that, I want to talk about something else. And before we do that, now's a good time to interrupt with any questions so far.
What was the article name?
I forget, but I could find you the link.
So it's on that page?
Yeah, this is it.
What was it? The bottom it says.
We don't still follow that niece thing, do we?
Oh, so what's the deal with marrying niece? Very good. So let's get to that. So, I'm going to sort of start, instead of starting from the top, I'm going to start from the bottom. There is a tzava, which we usually translate as will or ethical will, of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Who is Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid? Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is Rabbi Yehuda ben Shmuel of Regensburg. He was the leader of Hasidei Ashkenaz. His dates are 1150 to 1217, so way before what we call today the Hasidic movement. And this was a movement of pietistic people in Germany who became known, I think in their day they were known as Hasidim, but then later on, to contrast them with the movement of the Baal Shem Tov of Hasidus, they became known as Hasidei Ashkenaz. And Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is the most famous of the leader of Hasidei Ashkenaz, and he has written Sefer Hasidim and other things. Now, one of the unusual and curious things attributed to Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. As far as I know, there's no evidence that he actually ever wrote this. It seems to have been things that he gave over verbally, but over the years became into a book. And here I have an edition of the book published by Yotze HaPoskim, which is, as you can see, over 600 pages, and it has full of copious notes and references and halachic discussion to all the topics in Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is a strange sefer in that some of the things that it tells you not to do seem to be very strange. First of all, just strange, like that's unusual, and also strange halachically because they seem some of the things or many of the things seem to be in contradiction to things that the Gemara clearly assumes or says explicitly to be permissible. So this is a topic. Our attitude to Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is something which has busied many poskim. Much has been written on that topic in general, and that's as a whole beyond the scope of today's topic, but we're obviously going to get a little bit of a window into it. Some of the topics in Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid that have become famous, which I'm going to mention, so probably you've heard of some of these. Some people have heard of the Kpeda, people are careful when you're doing renovations in your home not to block up a window. If you're going to block up a window, to leave at least a tiny hole. The source of that is Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Some of you may have heard of the idea that a person, if he has a son and you honor somebody to be a sandik, you shouldn't give the same person to be sandik twice. The source of that's quite a famous minhag. The source of that is Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Another thing that is quite famous, certainly in Chabad, is to try and be careful that when you make a shidduch, that the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, or the son-in-law and father-in-law, should not have the same name. Again, the source of that is in Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. There are many other things that come in the Tzavah of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, and one of them is that Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid says that a person should not marry his niece. And in fact, in one of the editions, like I said, it wasn't originally written, it was originally Baal Peh, and sort of became written over the years. In one of the extant versions of the manuscripts, it says that if a person does this, Ula yesh tikva, perhaps there is hope. Aval yesh safek, it's not clear if there could ever be hope for somebody who does marry his niece. Now, it's interesting to note that if you do something that it says in Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid's Tzavah, and then it all ends in calamity, you might think, well, hey, maybe I shouldn't have done that. We don't find that at all. I haven't seen any evidence that there was any attitude by the Tzemach Tzedek or anyone in the family after this whole calamity to say, hey, maybe that was a mistake and we shouldn't have done it based on Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. However, that is an attitude that I have seen from the Rebbe. There is a letter. One of the things in the Tzavah of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is that you should not cut down a tree that makes fruit. Now, not cutting down a tree that makes fruit, there are halachas, but when you're not allowed to do that. But Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid seems to be saying that even at times when halachically it would be permissible to do so, you still shouldn't do so. So here there's a letter where, and the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch seems to say that it would be okay to do so in those cases when halachas allow it. But here somebody writes to the Rebbe some question about cutting down a tree. And in the letter he wrote to the Rebbe that he himself had personal experience with cutting down some sort of tree 3 years earlier, and something bad ended up happening there. And the Rebbe in that letter does seem to say that, based on all the circumstances and the different of opinions in the poskim, you should avoid it, especially because you had a personal negative experience with it. So we see that the Rebbe does seem to be taking his own personal experience of not listening to Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid and something bad happening afterwards into the picture, saying, best avoid it. So I do see that sentiment somewhat from the Rebbe. I have not seen that sentiment from the Tzemach Tzedek at all. Not only that, in Piskei Dinim of the Tzemach Tzedek, one of the Tzemach Tzedek's halachic works, he's referring to he brings up another thing that is mentioned in Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid, and that is that two brothers should not marry two sisters. You shouldn't have you shouldn't have the same mechutin twice. Which, again, many of the things in Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid, by the way, like marrying a niece or two brothers marrying two sisters, all these still marrying other relatives. A lot of these things nowadays, they raise eyebrows, both because medically it's not usually advised, and also I think in today's world, socially, that would be considered strange. But back in the shtetl, you've got to imagine that these type of things happened all the time. People marrying, two brothers to two sisters, or marrying nieces or cousins or relatives. I'm sure that happened all the time in the shtetl. And in this particular sefer of the Tzemach Tzedek, he writes that it says in Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid that you shouldn't have two brothers to two sisters, and he says, "V'ani shidachti es b'ni amuflig Yisrael Noach." My own son, the Tzemach Tzedek says, my own son Yisrael Noach married his wife, even though my daughter had already married the brother of that wife. So you had two siblings marrying two siblings, and says the Tzemach Tzedek, I myself was not concerned for what it says in Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid that you should not do that. Now, the Tzemach Tzedek doesn't say that I also violated Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid by allowing my son Shmuel to marry his niece, but also very possible that this was written before that should have happened. We don't have dates on when this. I personally don't know the date of when this was written. I didn't research if that information is known or not. But be that as it may, the Tzemach Tzedek continues to write that. One of the ways that the Paskim, the Rebbe Yehuda, and others deal with the whole problem of Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid, that how could Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid come and say not to do things which the Gemara clearly says you can do, is to say that Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid never meant this to be for everyone. He just meant it for his own descendants, that his own descendants should stick to these rules. But he never meant to say that all Jews should keep to these things. And so the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, there's no reason why the Tzemach Tzedek, who I guess we have there's no reason to assume that he's a descendant of Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid. So I'm allowed to take the same mechutin twice. I'm allowed to marry two of my children, two siblings. However, later on in this Sefer of the Tzemach Tzedek in Piskei Dinim, he writes that just because you find that the Gemara, the Amiroim, did something which Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid said not to do, doesn't mean that you should do it. Because he says you find, for example, the Gemara in Chulin Daf Zayin describes an encounter that Reb Chanina had with a sorceress. How do you say machshefa? A witch, yeah, and. He came out unaffected, and the Gemara says that was because Nafesh Zechusei, because Rabbi Chanina was a very pious person, and he had a lot of merits, so therefore he was not going to be damaged by this witch. But that doesn't mean that everybody else should try this at home. And so the Tzemach Tzedek is making the argument that just because you find the Gemara may have, let's say, taken a shidduch which Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid would deem inappropriate, doesn't mean that everybody else should do it. It could be the reason why the Amiroim were allowed to do it was because they were not affected by the dangers of Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid, because they were extra pious. Other poskim say a similar idea, that Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid is talking about people who would do it l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, versus if you're doing it just for your own pleasure, then it's not safe. But if you do it for the sake of the mitzvah, then it is a good idea. Of course, the idea of marrying a niece is even more strange than the other things, because the Gemara doesn't say anywhere that you should marry, let's say, somebody with the same name as the father-in-law and the son-in-law having the same name, or things like that. We find precedent that did occur. Whereas with marrying a niece, the Gemara specifically says that it's a mitzvah to marry a niece, and we're going to see soon why the Gemara says it's a mitzvah to marry a niece. However, the Tzemach Tzedek continues to say that he heard from his uncle in the name of the Alter Rebbe that specifically with the idea of the same names for son-in-law and father-in-law, and also mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, the reason we are careful about that in Chabad is because that is quoted by the Mishnas Chassidim. The Mishnas Chassidim is Rabbi Emanuel Chai Riki, who was his dates are 1687 to 1743. He was a very prominent Mekubal in Italy, and I believe. and he's aligned very much with the Kabbalah of the Arizal. So the Tzemach Tzedek says that the fact that the Mishnah's Chassidim brings this idea that a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law shouldn't have the same name indicates that it would be so according to the Arizal, in which case we would take that much more seriously than we would just if it's in Savas Rebuta Achasid. And the Tzemach Tzedek goes on to explain the Kabbalistic reason why a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law should not have the same name. But back to so anyway, just the summary of everything we've seen in the Tzemach Tzedek over here is that for the most part we're not so concerned with Savas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, and even in the case where possibly something sort of went wrong, and you could have said, well, hey, maybe that was because we didn't listen to Savas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. For the most part, we don't see that attitude taken, even though I did mention at least one case where the Rebbe does take that attitude with regard to cutting down a tree. Now, what's the deal with marrying a niece in the Gemara? So the Gemara says, referring to a pasuk in the book of Yeshaya, Oz tikra v'Hashem yaneh tishavei v'yomer hineni, that then you will call out and Hashem will answer you, and you will turn to Him and He will say, here I am, so that your prayers will be answered by God. So what do you have to do to get that? The Gemara gives three things that are good things to do, that big mitzvahs that cause Hashem to answer your prayers, and one of them is hanoise bas hachoisei, if you marry the daughter of your sister, that is your niece. Now so it's a mitzvah to marry your niece. Now in a moment we're going to see about if the Gemara's language is specific, that it's your sister's daughter versus your brother's daughter. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, why? Why is it a mitzvah to marry your niece? So, Rashi says, that a person is usually, a man is usually more emotionally connected to his sister than to his brother. So if you marry your sister's daughter versus your brother's daughter, then chances are you're going to feel more connected to her because it's your sister's daughter and you love your sister a lot. So it's a good idea to marry your sister. So the way Rashi is explaining it is, it's almost as if, well, we're taking for granted that you're going to marry your niece, and the question is, which niece should you marry, your brother's daughter or your sister's daughter? So it's preferable to marry your sister's daughter. However, others say, and Tosfos brings this in the name of the Rashbam, that it doesn't matter. Either one is good. Your brother's daughter or your sister's daughter. The actual correct term for that in English is fraternal niece or sororal niece. And the Gemara just says one, but it could have been the other. That's no problem. But then we have Rabbeinu Tam who says no. It's specifically your sister's daughter that you're supposed to marry. Why is it such a good idea to marry your sister's daughter? So Rabbeinu Tam says, but the Meiri says a very similar idea, just in a little bit more words. So I figured instead we'll just quote the Meiri, especially because I love to make Ari feel extra comfortable by bringing in the Meiri.
Go to all these rabbis, you quote mine too.
Exactly. Yesh mefarshim. So some says the Meiri. The Gemara says it's a mitzvah to marry your niece. Says the Meiri. Yesh mefarshim derech klal al kol kruva shaloi. Some say this means in general that it's a mitzvah to marry relatives. It's a mitzvah to marry in the family. And the reason the Gemara says niece is because that's the closest relative that you're allowed to marry. You're not allowed to marry your sister, obviously, so you're not even allowed to marry an aunt. That's one of the incestual relationships forbidden by the Torah. The closest relative that's permissible to marry is a niece. So the Gemara starts there, marry your niece. Obviously, you don't have a niece that's eligible, marry your cousin. That's better than marrying just some random guy. Right? I mean, even in the Torah we see Avraham, Yitzchak, there seems to be a value in inbreeding and marrying in the family. I mean, there you could say there could be other reasons for it. But anyway, why does it not say to marry your brother's daughter? So he brings two reasons. I'm going to jump to the second reason and then we'll get back to the first reason. The second reason is so that we already saw from Rashi, sorry. He says like this. Why is it a good idea to marry family? because within the family you're going to have similar personalities, and so there's chances for the success in the shidduch. If you're all from the same sort of background and within the family, it's going to be success for shidduch, and therefore it's going to be good. It's going to be success. Shalom bayis.
Families in those days?
Oh, I don't know if they knew the word dysfunction yet. But then he says, and therefore specifically your sister's daughter, because the Gemara says in Bava Basra Daf Kuf Yud Amud Aleph that Roiv Banim Doimim La'achei Ha'im, that usually children turn out similar in their personalities to their mother's siblings, right? You become more similar to your mother's siblings than to your father's siblings. And so, if you want to find a wife who's going to be the most similar to you, so the most highest chances for shalom bayis is marry your sister's daughter. She's going to be the most similar to you, even more similar than your brother's daughter. Okay? That's the Meiri's take on this whole thing. And in general, I would say, sort of, if you want to just make it the way the Meiri and Rashi present it, and even Tosfos, it seems to be about the most successes for the most chances for better shalom bayis. The way the Rambam codifies this is that he says that it's in fulfillment of mipsarcha al tisalam, that you should not ignore your own family. And I think the way I registered that Rambam is that marriage in general, especially in those days, was like the husband is going to take care of the wife. Think of the conversation between Boaz and Rus, right? I'm going to take care of the wife. So when you're talking about taking care of people, well, charity starts at home, and so it's a mitzvah to marry family, and specifically your niece. That's the way the Rambam puts it. There's one moment.
Marrying your nieces.
Yeah, the Rambam, and by the way, this is brought in Shulchan Aruch, and it's brought even in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Even in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is fairly contemporary, it says it's a mitzvah to marry a niece. L'maisa, nowadays, most medical advice would go against this. I don't know whether or not there's genetic testing that could certify that there won't be any medical issues. I don't know. And I think for the most part nowadays, people are not very common to marry their nieces, and even cousins, people don't marry. Sorry?
Isn't it the law, state law or something?
I don't know.
Whether cousins in Illinois can marry each other?
Or any state, or I don't know. I thought there was...
I'm not familiar with the secular law on this topic. I will say that in the Hasidic world, in some communities within the Chassidish world, it's especially in Rebbeisha families, in sort of the aristocratic families, it's still very common for a lot of families to marry within each other. I mean, I can show you some Wikipedia pages that are so confusing. The guy has 15 children, and all of them are the same. Yeah. 15 children and all of them married, and only 3 mechutan. Yeah, it's wild stuff. But actually, personally, I have a first cousin who married his niece, and they're about the same age. And as far as I know, they live happily ever after. Okay. Anyway, but there is another opinion in the Rishonim that says it's specifically that you're supposed to marry your. And by the way, we're soon going to get to another very original reason why Chazal say it's a mitzvah to marry your niece, which Ari is going to be right up your alley. But you're going to have to be patient for that. But before.
Second cousins are legally allowed to marry in every state. However, marriage between first cousins is legal only in about half of the American states.
Yeah.
So
what about a niece?
I heard people have moved for this reason.
What about a niece? Maybe we shouldn't go there. Anyway,
there is some law covering this.
Yeah.
That explains the whole Hasidic sect in Kentucky.
All right. All right. So. Here's an interesting thing that the Meiri brings this, and this is I think Rabbi Tam is also holds this. He says like this: there's a specific reason why you should not marry your brother's daughter. Why? Because this is going to affect fulfillment of the mitzvah of Yibum. What happens if the brother dies? Sorry, if the brother dies, if you marry your. If you marry your niece, that your fraternal niece, that means your brother's daughter, and then not anyone here has children, right? If you die without children, so then the brother is not going to be able to do yibum, the levirate marriage, because you're not allowed to marry your own daughter.
Right.
So to avoid that type of situation, we say don't marry your brother's daughter, marry your somebody else, your sister's daughter, and that way, if you die, the other brother will be able to do yibum, and everybody will live happily ever after. Okay, that's another approach to this topic. Okay, so let's summarize the story so far. We have a Gemara that says it's a mitzvah to marry your niece. We have a machloikus that discusses whether it's specifically a sororal niece or even a fraternal niece. There seems to be a number of different reasons of why it's a mitzvah to marry your niece, but all along the lines of somehow enhancing shalom bayis. We have Tzavos Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid that says that you should not marry your niece. The question is, did Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid mean this for everybody, or did he only mean it for his own descendants? Even if he didn't, perhaps Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid meant to say that it depends if you're doing it for l'shem shamayim, because you want to have a mitzvah, and let's say the mitzvah of shalom bayis, or the mitzvah of marrying your niece, without getting into what the reason for the mitzvah is, then it will be good. But if you're doing it for your own personal, because of your own debased taivus or whatever it is, so then it's not a good idea. Either way, we've seen that our attitude to Tzavaras Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is ambivalent, certainly lukewarm, and not necessarily very binding. Now, we still have to, I get to one moment to the tshuva of the Divrei Nechemia, which we're going to summarize soon, but there is an interesting article which I found on this foreign blog, which I'm going to read to you snippets from. It's in English. I'm just going to read it to you straight as it is, and I found it very interesting. Yes, Ali?
No, that's what general, but I thought about which we take.
And general questions will leave afterwards. Okay, so just if you want to find this, the title of this article is Avunculate Marriage. Is that how you pronounce that word? Avunculate Marriage in the Bible by Reuven Chaim Klein. This was published on this foreign blog on October 25th, 2015. The term avunculate marriage, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, refers to marriage between a man and his niece. In this paper, we will explore the Bible's view on the permissibility of such unions and discuss several examples of such marriages in the Bible. Not only does rabbinic literature generally presume that such marriages are permitted, the Talmud even encourages it. On the other hand, other sources ban these relationships. The Sadducees believe that the Bible forbids such marriages. While various Tosafos believe that such marriages are biblically permitted, they still prohibit marrying one's niece, at least in some cases when it's a fraternal niece, for other reasons. Okay, so he goes through the whole Torah, starting off by Avraham and Nachor. At least a simple reading of the psukim there seems to suggest that Avraham and Nachor both married their niece. Now then we have, moving on to Dinah. Later in Genesis, the Bible relates that when Yosef was the Egyptian viceroy, he married Asnas, the daughter of Potiphera. According to many midrashic sources, he brings the sources, Asnas was none other than the daughter of Dinah and her rapist Shechem. This illegitimate child was initially shunned by Yaakov's family, but eventually found her way back in by marrying Yosef. Thus, Yosef's wife Asnas was his niece, the daughter of his sister Dinah. Although others understand that Asnas was actually an Egyptian woman, the midrashic sources above reject the notion that Yosef would marry a non-Israelite woman. 1 second. Similarly, Rabbi Chaim Paltiel quotes a medrash which says that Shimon married the daughter of Dinah. Was born by, quotes a medrash which says that Shimon married the daughter of Dinah who was born by rape through Shechem. According to this medrash, which is Shimon married his niece, the daughter of his sister Dinah. These examples differ from others under consideration because these are the only explicit examples of a man marrying his sororal niece, i.e. his sister's daughter. All the other examples involve a man marrying his fraternal niece, i.e. his brother's daughter. Okay, moving on. Asniel and Achsa, in the book of Yehoshua, chapter 15, and in the opening chapter of Judges, Kalev offers his daughter Achsa to whoever would conquer the Canaanite stronghold of Kiryat Sefer. And Asniel, the son of Kenaz, Kalev's younger brother, took it, and he, namely Kalev, gave him, namely Asniel, Achsa, his daughter, to his wife. So Asniel succeeded in conquering the city and thus won the hand of his brother's daughter Achsa in marriage. Most assume that Asniel was Kalev's full brother, although some explain that they shared only a mother and not a father, in which case that might have halachic relevance as well. Okay, moving on to Shavuos, to Megillah of Rus, and Elimelech and Naomi, according to at least one opinion in the various familial lineages over there, Elimelech was the uncle of Naomi. And then, of course, we can't we can't skip mentioning Purim, Mordechai and Esther. The Talmud relates that Mordechai not only raised the orphaned Esther, but also married her. Furthermore, some sources, including Josephus in Antiquities, Targum Rishon, and I'm not sure what that is, explain that Esther was Mordechai's niece. Ibn Ezra also says that it was his niece. There is he says here Maimonides. I'm not convinced that it's Maimonides. There is a book that purports to be Maimonides, the Rambam's commentary to Esther. It's something that was found in the Cairo Geniza. I don't think it really is. It doesn't sound Maimonidean at all, but it's available there on Hebrew books. You could find it. And then also there is the idea that his there is seem to be some sort of indication from the Targum that he mentions it here. Targum here that Esther was Mordechai's niece. Nonetheless, this understanding is simply mistaken, as the Megillah quite explicitly states that she was his first cousin and not his niece. I mentioned to you already last week that there seems to be some more on this discussion, and perhaps we'll return to that, but certainly the simple understanding is that Esther was Mordechai's cousin, not his niece, and so the whole Mordechai and Esther is a mute point as far as our discussion is concerned, although I had to mention it because we're in the month of Adar, so we had to. Now, then we move on. He brings here the Gemara, which we already learned about whether it's a mitzvah to marry your niece, and whether that applies to all types of niece or only to your sister's daughter. So we're not going to read that whole thing again. Now here he says something very interesting. The Sadducee view of forbidden relationships. Now basically, to go through the Sadducee view of forbidden relationships is, first of all, we're not here to study Sadduceanism, and also it's very complicated because you have to sort of keep track of these complicated family trees. But essentially what the Sadducees are doing is they're saying that anything that Torah says about a man also applies to a woman. And so by their logic, if the Torah says you're not allowed to marry your aunt, by the same token it would mean, if an uncle is not allowed to if a nephew is not allowed to marry his aunt, so then by the same token a niece should not be allowed to marry her uncle. The Torah just says one of them, and it means the other. So anyway, he goes through the whole Sadducean thing in this article. We're not going to go through that, but he does finish off by pointing to a number of problems with the Sadducean approach, and one of them being that if you go through all the arayos, all the incestual relationships that the Torah forbids, and you do it according to the Sadducean method of interpretation, there's going to be 3 pairs of redundancies. In other words, things that the Torah repeats that there's no need for it to repeat, because once you've said one side, half of the coin, the other side of the coin goes automatically, versus Chazal's interpretation, which doesn't do that, and also creates 4 new cases of incense which are not mentioned in the Bible. Okay, so there's a problem. Then here's where
they'll say sure, yeah.
They
probably do say all that.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they say all of them. I think the problem. Again, you could look up the article if you want to get into more details of the Sadducean approach. The reason why I bring up the Sadducean approach is because I found the next suggestion really fascinating, and this is what I was alluding to before. Saul Lieberman. So Saul Lieberman, I don't know if we're allowed to quote him in a Chabad house, but I think we are. Saul Lieberman himself was a big Talmud Chacham. In fact, some of his farm are very prominently displayed in the library upstairs in 770. I don't mean the Rebbe's library, I mean in the yeshiva library upstairs in 770. But anyway, Saul Lieberman himself was a big Talmud Chacham, and he was a Frum Yid, etc. But he did take a position in, what's it called, JTS? Which is a conservative organization. In those days, things were a little bit different. Regardless, listen to what he says. Saul Lieberman argues that the rabbis classified marrying one's niece as a positive deed specifically in order to counter the Sadducean view that marrying one's niece is biblically forbidden. He notes it is the rabbi's way to take things which are simply allowed by the Bible and encourage people to do them in order to undermine sectarian heretical views. So I found that to be absolutely fascinating.
You see many examples of that in the Gemara.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, they say you shouldn't do it, we're going to do it.
Exactly. He finishes off by saying, interestingly, in his above-mentioned work, Ashtori HaParchi, we've mentioned HaParchi many times. Ashtori HaParchi, his sefer is called, oh my God, what's the name? No? The name slipped my mind, but Ashtori HaParchi notes that the Sadducees were not innovators in banning marriage to a niece. They adopted the prohibition from the Samaritans, who took the idea from the Arabs. Later, the Karaites also followed suit and outlawed uncle-niece marriages. Okay. So then he goes through the whole Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid thing and discusses that. All right. So bottom line is, marrying nieces is certainly allowed according to halacha and even encouraged. Now, we have here a tshuva from the Divrei Nehemiah, which we already mentioned before. Rebbe Nehemiah Dubrovna was a big posek, a Talmud of the Alter Rebbe, and he was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, but certainly the Tzemach Tzedek also very much respected him. And the Tzemach Tzedek, in that period in Tafresh Ches, leading up to this shidduch, the Tzemach Tzedek addressed a question to the Divrei Nehemiah of whether or not this is an appropriate shidduch to pursue. And the main issue with the shidduch that the Tzemach Tzedek, that we don't have the letter of the Tzemach Tzedek to Rebbe Nehemiah of Dubrovna. We only have the response of the Divrei Nehemiah back to the Tzemach Tzedek, and we're left to do a little bit of guesswork to figure out what's going on. So the Rebbe Nehemiah Dubrovna's tshuva starts off with quoting the Gemara, which we mentioned before, that lo'elam alishana adam ben abanim, that a person should not favor one child over the other. And so here the concern was, it seems, should I favor Reb Chaim Shnei Zalman by choosing his daughter over Reb Baruch Shalom by choosing his daughter, or vice versa? So the Tzemach Tzedek, it seems, wrote to the Divrei Nehemiah that here we could differentiate and say that when should you not favor one son over the other just randomly? But there's a specific mitzvah involved. You shouldn't forego on a mitzvah so as not to offend the other son. Case in point, there's a specific mitzvah to marry your niece. And so if it's a mitzvah to marry your niece, we should not avoid the mitzvah of marrying your niece just so as not to offend the other child. Says Rebbe Nehemiah, no, I'm not even so sure about that. In fact, in the Trumas Hadeshen we find that even for the mitzvah of Pir V'Rivya, to have more children, you could avoid that mitzvah so as not to create strife. Case in point is in Trumas Hadeshen chapter Siman Reish Samach Gimel, chapter 263, where he asks the question that Ruvain has already fulfilled. Ruvain is a hypothetical person. In fact, the whole Shuvas HaMadeshin is hypothetical situations, which he himself created in order to address. And so Ruvain has already fulfilled the mitzvah of Pir V'Rivya. He already has children. His wife dies, and now he wants to remarry, but he's afraid that maybe his new wife and his children won't get along so well. But on the one hand, he has a mitzvah to remarry, to continue having children. On the other hand, he doesn't want there to be dysfunction in the home. So what overrides what? And the Trumas Hadeshen allows for him to refrain from having more children so as to maintain peace in the home. So certainly in this case, you don't need to do the mitzvah of marrying your niece and rather maintain the peace at home. And especially that maybe it's not even a mitzvah, because in this case it's his brother's daughter, which according to some of the Rishonim is no mitzvah. The mitzvah is specifically the sister's daughter. However, Rebbe Nehemiah then does a 180 and he says no. He says that with many of these type of things where the Gemara says don't do X because of such and such a precedent, we say we limit it k'maisa shahaya. In other words, why are we saying that you shouldn't favor one son over the other? Because look what happened when Yaakov favored Yosef. So then you have to say that we're going to stick to the parameters of our original prototype story, Yaakov favoring Yosef. Now, we could in the case of Yaakov favoring Yosef, first of all, over there was no mitzvah. Here, at least according to some opinions, there's a mitzvah to marry a niece. That's first of all. And secondly, over there, you have to differentiate between something which doesn't have a din chalukah. In other words, Yaakov is giving extra silk to Yosef. Well, why are you giving extra silk to him? Give extra silk to everyone. No, you only have X amount of silk. Divide it equally between everyone. Whereas here, you can't give it to both. You can't say marry half of this niece and half of that niece. You have to choose one over the other. You cannot marry. You can't have him marrying both nieces. And so, in that case, so in order not to offend the other brother, you're going to marry somebody else who's not related. You're not mechuyev to go and marry somebody else who's not related, so as not to favor one brother over the other. Over here, it's something which cannot be split any other way. It's yes or no. It's not. You can't split it 50-50 like you can with money. And then he adds a curious line. He says, anyway, it's not really you making the decision, because the decision of the shidduch was already decided in heaven before the child was born, and so it doesn't really matter what you decide. It's already chosen. All right. Now then he says, what?
Does he have a Trumas Hadeshen to question that?
No, he doesn't. Then he brings up what's disturbing you?
Trumas Hadeshen seems to go against this whole premise. Trumas Hadeshen just said just before about marrying and having another kid, and he doesn't go with this line of reasoning.
Okay, Lemaisa, I hear it's a good horror. He doesn't say that. Okay, now he goes to the point that Rebbe Chanan mentioned before, and he says, in the Bible is full of stories of succession, and he brings some stories from the Gemara also, but let's stick to stories in Nach. There's full of stories in Nach of the king dies, and one of his children over all the other children take over, and we don't say, hey, you can't make one child become king, you have to divide it equally. Why? Because the monarchy cannot be divided, and so obviously it must be. This sort of goes to prove his point that the whole idea of not favoring one child over the other is only when it comes to something like money, which you could divide equally. But taking over succeeding the monarchy, or I think somebody here mentioned, maybe David Yehuda, succeeding as leader of the community, or in this case, making a shidduch with one niece over the other, that's not something which can be divided. It's a yay or nay. There's no way to divide it, and so it would not apply. But then he goes on to say that no, that there could be a difference over here. And here's where we're going to come back to the Rambam, which is how I got into this whole topic to begin with, in connection with the siyum that we made last week on the laws of inheritance in the book of Mishpatim. And that is, he says, that it could be that there's a difference between during your lifetime and posthumously. Posthumously, we say, all the cases that he mentioned before, Nach, the guy succeeds his father, the child succeeds his father as king. That's after the father dies. After the father dies, he gets it Medin Yerusha. This is not the father giving it to the child. It's sort of the Torah gave it to the child in the framework of inheritance of Yerusha, and within that framework, we're not concerned about jealousy. V'haraya, the Torah gives a double portion to the firstborn, and we don't say, oh no, the other kids are going to be jealous. And by the way, ask your local competent Orthodox rabbi and speak to your lawyer who knows halacha how to make a will in a way that nowadays we do not usually recommend doing the mitzvah of double to the firstborn at least entirely. Usually we say you just leave over one item, let's say one area to fulfill that mitzvah, but generally the estate should be divided equally. And by the way, there's a new book just published last week or 2 weeks ago from Daniel Feldman from YU, something spirit and something or other about halachic loopholes, and I'm pretty sure, I met him here at a wedding at, I think, it was by Mark Siegel's son's wedding, I believe. I sat next to him at a Teres Ayala, and I'm pretty sure he told me that he has a chapter in that book on this specific topic. But back to the case in point, says from Nehemiah, we see that there's no. We see that when it comes to Yerusha, then we're not concerned. So that's why you're allowed to have a king choosing one child to succeed him over the others, because that's in the context of Yerusha. But here, whereas you're making a shidduch within the lifetime of the Tzemach Tzedek, then that would, and only one of your children is going to get to be your mechutin and not the other, then that would not be allowed. And then he says, so where we're up to right now in the whole discussion, it would seem to suggest that the Tzemach Tzedek should not do the shidduch. So now he comes to the Rambam. He says a fascinating thing. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Nachlas, I think it's chapter 6, the Laws of Inheritance, chapter 6. It's interesting, by the way, he says, I'll get to it. So the Rambam writes, it's in the end of chapter 6 of the Laws of Inheritance, where he says, Shelo Yeshana Adam Ben Abonim B'Chayav. The Rambam adds the words into the Gemara. The Rambam says you should not make a difference between one child over the other in your lifetime. Where does the Rambam get that word in your lifetime from? Says I'll tell you why the Rambam is adding the word in your lifetime. The Rambam is saying that that precisely this point, that you see all these stories in Nach where the child succeeds the father. So it must be that the reason why that's permissible is because it's after their lifetime, and so here where it's still in the lifetime of the Tzemach Tzedek it would be forbidden. But then he says no, it could be, because what's the context? You have to, don't just look at this one word in isolation in the Rambam. Look at the whole context. The context is the laws of inheritance. In the laws of inheritance there's a prohibition of havaras nachla. That means there's a prohibition that you're not allowed to take away your inheritance from your children. You're not allowed to say, you're my firstborn son, you're not going to get a double lot. You're not allowed to do that. And then the Rambam is coming to say that not only are you not allowed to remove the inheritance, take away the inheritance from your child, even in your lifetime you're not allowed to differentiate between your children. So it's not specifically in your lifetime.
Boys or girls too?
beyond the scope. Good question, beyond the scope. So whereas initially we're looking at the Rambam and saying, hey, the Rambam is qualifying and saying, don't favor your children in your lifetime. But now he's saying, if you look at the broader context, the opposite is true. He's not qualifying and saying it not to favor them in your lifetime. He's saying the opposite. Not only after you die should you not differentiate between, should you not take away the inheritance from them. Even in your lifetime, you have to be careful not to differentiate between them. And so, hold on a second. If even so we're saying even in your lifetime, B'meila, that would imply that this shidduch should be permissible, because back to square one, we're saying why we're back to square one and saying that the prohibition is only k'maisa shahoya, like the case of Yosef, which is something that was possible to divide differently, but when it comes to marriage, or succession for that matter, we're not disturbed by that. And the reason we're not disturbed by that is because when it's something that's not possible to divide up, then we have no prohibition against dividing, against favoritism of one child over the other. He then continues to say that it could be that after death, that in a lifetime we're concerned even about a small favoritism, versus after death, if you just give one a little bit of a favor over the other, so then what's the concern? He's dead already. What do you care how much he loves you? He's dead already. Masha'inkin, if you make a huge difference and he gets a lot of money and he gets no money, then that could cause strife. And I found that striking, because I think with today's modern sensitivities, I would think almost the opposite would be true, that if it's after the death that somebody starts feeling that, hey, my father loved the other child more than me, that would be more traumatic than during the lifetime where you could sort of have it out. But this is the reality he lives with. Anyway, bottom line is the Divrei Nehemiah indeed did give the Samach Tzedek, so to speak, the go-ahead for the shidduch. He finishes off with some more small minor points in favor of it, and the rest is history, as we saw in the beginning. And that's the end of the summary of this topic. Steve, it looks like you have a lot to say.
Some of these are just notes myself, but just picking up something, my question a minute ago. So, from the brother's point of view, who has the two daughters, the two nieces, so, right, the son of the other brother is going to pick one of the two daughters. Isn't there a priority? Doesn't the oldest daughter have to go first, or there's no priority from the other? Well,
those two girls are cousins, and they're probably approximately the same age.
They're sisters, aren't they?
No, they were cousins. The whole point was that there were
two brothers.
The problem, you have the chassan, who's the Rebbe Mahara, and you have two of his brothers.
There were two brothers. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the point of contention in the tshuva seems to be that both of these brothers were vying for the opportunity to become their father's mechutin, so to speak, and that was where the context of who are you favoring over the other.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to change the scenario a little bit. Let's say it's two daughters, it's one brother, and there's two daughters. So there's still both nieces. Is there a priority? Do you have to take the older niece over the younger niece, or?
So there is. Yes, but that's a less binding priority. Specifically when it comes to girls, there is this idea that you should ideally sort of get married in order, but it's not absolute.
Okay. So some of the other. Okay. So I can see some advantage and disadvantages from the man's point of view in marrying a niece. Even though sometimes with big families, the niece can be about the same age as the uncle. But for the most part, there's a fairly large age difference, right? So I can see some advantages in that. One is you marry a younger woman, she can have a lot more babies. Okay, so that's a practical. I don't know if this plays into any of this, but that's a practical.
I think that you have to sort of be a little bit more historical minded over here and say two things. First of all, that once upon a time, it was probably much more common to have big age gaps between the husband and the wife. And number two, it was also probably a lot more common for people to have nieces the same age as them, because women died, life expectancy, especially for women, was a lot shorter. And so often women died young, and the father would marry a second or third marriage, someone who's much younger, so that's how you would have In fact, for example, one of the very famous shidduchim in the Chassidish world is one of the Tzanze Rebbe's, Reb Chaim of Tzanze's youngest son, who's I always struggle to pronounce this word, Rapoport or something like that. Who later on, anyway, he still has he has a daughter in Brazil who passed away recently, but there's still sort of some continuation to that dynasty. And he married his niece, who was his same age. But that's because the Tzanze Rav had, I think, 3 of maybe even 4 wives, 4 marriages. So you're sort of thinking of it from contemporary terms that nieces and uncles are not usually the same age, but I mean, once you're going to that, it's kind of more or less moot, because nowadays we don't do it anyway for medical reasons and all sorts of other things.
Okay, so there's no. So what you're saying is, the times are different, and there wasn't really much in the way of practical considerations.
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, it seems pretty clear to me. I don't know the exact dates, but it seems pretty clear that the Maharash and his nieces were all around the same age. They were all in their early teens.
Okay, takes care of the rest of my questions.
Oh, one quick question. Regarding the comparison they're trying to make it to other instances of Yerusha or kingship, there's quite a big distinction. I think the question really here is what is more paramount to the other, right? Oh, no, what is more, no, which one is more valuable, right? What do you sort of prioritize? The priority is going to be the mitzvah, so to say, of marrying a niece, or the concern for, let's say, jealousy, right? Whereas when we're talking about a king or Yerusha, it's totally different. There, Torah has a separate mitzvah, clearly, right? That you can't say is qualified, we're going to say kingship is only when there's no separate siblings. There's a mitzvah of kingship, there's a mitzvah of Yerusha. Yerusha is clearly in a case where there's division. And still, the mitzvah is like this. Over here, even if you want to say it's a mitzvah, that's still, you have a separate question, which is, does Torah, is it concerned about jealousy amongst others? And I don't think you can bring a parallel of those examples in general.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me, from the room, from the sort of atmosphere that you get over here, that it's almost, it seems, again, there's so much that we don't know and we're guessing over here, but you sort of get the vibe that the Tzemach Tzedek didn't, it was just a question, like it was really important to Tzemach Tzedek that he marry one of his nieces, and it was just a question of sorting out the family dynamics, and the Tzemach Tzedek seemed, for whatever reason, to be very reluctant to marry somebody else. And by the way, I think the person...
You should have gotten okay from the other ones to sign off on it. That would have been the best. I mean, you probably couldn't, but...
I mean, you've got to also... I mean, in the end, actually, I think the Rabbi Rivka, who he did end up marrying, I think was also a relative, a cousin or something.
I don't know. I didn't understand what you said. Like, there's a mitzvah that